everybody. You are on Groomed.Connect. Brian, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
We are, this is the day, we're taping this 2 days after Thanksgiving. I say taping, nobody tapes it anymore. We're recording this. There's no tape involved.
Yes.
We're recording this right after Thanksgiving. Brian, how was your Thanksgiving?
It was great. It was great. Had the whole family over. Ate some of my finely curated brisket and various other things. Had a good time. How about you?
Good. It was relaxing, actually. I'm reading a book right now called The Anxious Generation. It has to do with what I do for a living with talking to teenagers, and it's a little heavy. And so I read 3 chapters and then put it down and watched some football, and so I'll pick it back up again here. So I'm on break. I'm on break actually until the mid-January.
Nice.
I don't have a school. Yeah, it's kind of nice just to take a little break and retool. I'm going to be doing some retooling with some parent stuff and putting some more content out for parents on our Value Up website. So yeah, just kind of not rebranding, but packing the brand a little bit with more content. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing. So, all right. So we want to jump right into this. First of all, we want to, every once in a while, we're going to show these weird pictures of Jesus. Yeah, I don't know what that is. I just don't know. But this one here, this is what I think a lot of people want their Jesus to be, right? This American hero, he looks like The Rock with hair, and he's got the American flag draped around him, and let's make America holy again. Let's anti-gay the whole country. Anyways, I digress. But so yeah, we just wanted to jump into this, and basically, we're gonna call this something that's going to be a little controversial, but it comes out of a conversation that I had. I was in Ohio somewhere, and I was speaking to schools, and a lot of times when I'm, in the evening, I just go to Applebee's somewhere or something like that, sit at the bar. I don't drink, but I'll sit at the bar and get something to eat, and then hang out, and I'm a talker, so I ended up talking to this guy one day, and we were just talking about life. He's asked me what I did for a living and blah blah blah, and going into all that. And then it got into the church stuff, and I talked about how I used to be a youth pastor, and he started to go down this rabbit hole of his church experience, and we just went back and forth about who Jesus really is, and how the church just really perverts it. And he had his own story and his experiences that were horrible with pastors that were abusive and manipulative and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't really unpack the whole, my story with Jeannie and all that stuff. But we were just going on. And finally, he looks at me and he said something that I went, "Ooh, this is a little crazy, but I like it." He goes, "It's like they're selling shitty Jesus." And I'm like, "That's a podcast." Someday that is going to be a podcast, because it's as raw as it comes. But honestly, that's the way I feel that exact way. It's this version of Jesus that they keep pumping out that really has nothing to do with Jesus. It's actually antichrist. I mean, this whole, we're going to unpack it, but this whole idea that you have to perform for Jesus and otherwise he's not going to accept you is so anti the gospel and so anti-Christ. And he said it, they're selling shitty Jesus. And I like the fact he said selling, because they have to sell that, right? That doesn't come out of your spirit. Right. That's not something we resonate with and go, "Oh, I like that Jesus." Yeah. No, you have to sell that to me. You're gonna have to put on a show and convince me that that's the right way. So what do? You play on my fear. You play on the lowest form of righteousness, and the actors. We're going to get into all that. But Brian, what are your thoughts on that originally?
Well, for one thing, let's just start with the word shitty. I want to talk to all of you out there who are like covering your ears and running for cover, right? And this really gets into a lot of what we want to talk about. But I always find it funny that you can walk into church and you can hear a conversation like, "Oh man, I'm tired of this frickin' crap." You know, gosh darn it. You know,
Yeah.
we've developed this, sort of way to Christian cussing, right?
Right.
And because because you can't say those other words for some reason. I don't know. Um, they've got
Coarse language, Brian. It's coarse language.
it's coarse language. Yeah, yeah, whatever. And so I just want to say, if the words you hear are really bothering you because it's the words you hear, you might want to go a little bit deeper with that and check that, because they're just words. And you know what? You've all made up substitute words to go in their place, because the emotions behind those things are what's generating that. You just figured out a culturally acceptable way to say them in your church
Right.
circles. So,
Right.
you know,
Right.
if you're offended by the title of this podcast, I'll say that Mike and I are sorry, but get over it.
Yeah.
Uh,
I had somebody one time said to me, they wanted to say Jesus Christ, and they said cheese and rice, and I was like, what? Okay, cheese and rice. Okay,
yeah,
how do you feel better?
yeah, yeah. So, it all comes back. We talked about this in the last podcast. I think is worth talking about a little bit more. But it all talks about, this idea of a persona. And I was talking with Cheryl about this a little bit, and she was reading to me. She was reading me. uh, the definition of the word hypocrite from the Greek, and really the word hypocrite is simply an actor. It's someone pretending to be something that they're not. And I think this whole idea of shitty Jesus is an extension of that. We're presenting a Jesus in our own image, a Jesus that we're comfortable with, a Jesus that we want to exist because that Jesus makes us feel better, about ourselves, makes us feel like we have power or leverage, or we're on the good side, or those kinds of things. But it's a manufactured Jesus. It's God in our own image.
Yeah, I remember. I've mentioned this before, but I was standing in church one day, and when I was working at a church in Denver, and Marilyn Hickey would bring these speakers in that were decent, and sometimes they were awful. And she just find them out in the road when she was out speaking, and she'd bring them in. With this one guy, he was up talking. At the beginning, I wasn't too impressed, but then all of a sudden, he looked at the audience, and this is a mega church with a bunch of money in there. There's a lot of money in there. The front row was worth a couple $1 billion. I mean, it was a money church, and I remember him like looking at the audience, and he said, if Jesus Christ was the pastor of this church, half of you wouldn't go here. And immediately I stood up. I was like, whoa, oh, I sat up actually, and I was like, oh, I like this guy. And then he started going through it, and he was like, basically the prostitutes would be here, the mafia would be here. You couldn't stand his audience. You would not be able to handle his audience. And it goes back to that. We were talking this week, Brian and I were, and I found this quote by Carl Jung, and he said basically, let me read this the right. Basically, it says, um, the modern church, the modern Christianity can't find Jesus because they don't look low enough.
Yeah.
And I love that quote. I was like, oh my goodness, I've never heard that before. And I think that's exactly right. Like, we keep trying to paint this picture of Jesus, that's just this holy, you know, um, character that just wants to clean up the world and clean up the country and make it safe for our children, and bring morality back into the streets, and or into the schools or whatever. And it's not the Jesus that I see in the gospel.
Yeah, and by clean up and morality, you mean from our perspective, what we want to define as clean, what we want to define as morality, which ultimately, my experience in the church, okay, I can't speak for every church, I've not been to every church, but my experience in the church, those are all the things, again, that reinforce us, that make us feel better about ourselves, because we don't smoke or chew or go with girls who do, right? There's really no biblical underpinning for the moral code. We talked about this last week, that or there is little anyway, or it's misinterpreted. We just want to impose this system on people, and we want to push this Jesus out there who's doing our bidding to make the world the way we think it should look.
Right. And it goes back to what you said earlier about the acting. You know,
Right.
we got somebody who commented, and I had already mentioned this on our Groomed in 10, but this quote, it said, people who tell others how to act create good actors. And to me, that's what we're doing in the American church, is we're creating these actors. And I mentioned this again on the Groomed in 10, but this, I was ushering, not ushering, I was um, greeting at my church last Sunday. And this guy, right when I was just looking out the window and he was walking into the church. And just as he walked in, he hit the vape, and he hit it hard. Like there was a big puff of, smoke or whatever that stuff is, that, kind of went away real fast, because that's how that works. But it was just so funny because I watched him, and then, he came in and he shook my hand, and he was coming into this church. And to be honest with you, Brian, I think that is a microcosm, or a really good picture
Yeah.
of how people feel on the inside when they walk into most churches in America. It's like, okay, I'm ready to put on a show now. And before I do that, I'm going to hit this vape. I'm not judging the vape. I don't care if he vapes. I could care less. But the bottom line is that he's doing something in his body to prepare him for the anxiety of having to walk into a place where he's got to put on a show, right?
Yeah.
Where he's got to act. He's got to, act like a Christian. It's like, I'm not a Christian, but I play one on TV, right? I'm not a Christian, but I play one, every Sunday morning from 10 o'clock to 11:30, right? You know what I mean? Like we have to satisfy the masses. We can't just be real about what's really going on in our lives. 70% of Christian men deal with pornography. How many churches actually talk about that from the pulpit?
Right.
Right? Oh my God, that's dirty. We can't talk about that. Well, what are you doing then? You're just training these guys how to act, right?
Yeah.
They act like they're not dealing with that. But meanwhile, they're sitting in a building where you're talking about righteousness. You're talking about a Jesus who loves us no matter what, right? Loves us in our darkest place, but we can't talk about that, right? We can't talk about that. There's a quote that I love, and I don't know who said this, but sin is the language of the wounded.
Yeah.
Sin is the language of the broken or the wounded, but we shut everybody up in church, right?
Yeah.
If sin is the language of the wounded,
Yeah.
you can't talk in church. You can't talk about that stuff. You can't talk about what's really going on. You can't talk about the anger and the fear and the stuff that's really happening in my life as a single mom, as a single dad, as a whatever. We can't be real in church, right? You have to put on a show. You have to act a certain way. It's almost like they hand you a script, right? Here's your script, and you just go with the script. And that's why people are leaving the church, because it's not real to them. It's not real where they live, right?
Well, and it's not real to them. It's just not real, period. Yeah, it's interesting. You bring up the statistic about Christian men who look at pornography, and it's actually tragic, because in many places the church creates a stigma that, like, oh, that's a really bad sin, that's really naughty, you better stop doing that, let's lay hands on you and pray that away, which is just, I mean, since we're talking about shitty Jesus, that's bullshit, right? There's something behind that, and we stigmatize that action as sin, but really there's something behind that. There's something deeper that's driving a person to act in whatever way they're acting, And when you were telling that story, I was thinking about the story in the Gospels about Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well, and um, she comes up and she, talks about, I have a husband, and he says, actually, you have 5 husbands, and he didn't, in my mind, when I read that, I don't see him saying, yeah, you're a bad person. He's just saying, you know what, this is really what's going on in your life. Now let's get to the core of where you're at. And she walked away. What's interesting to me about that encounter is she walked away saying, hey, you got to come see this dude. He is awesome. She didn't walk away in shame with her head hung low, thinking like, oh man, I'm a rotten person, and this amazing teacher just put me in my place. No, she walked away saying, hey, you got to come you got to come meet this guy. And to me,
Yeah.
that paints a picture of the fact that he was honest and genuine with her, and he created a space where she could be honest and genuine, and she felt safe, and she encountered that was an encounter with the reality of true love. I believe that's what that story says to me. And we don't know how to do that in the church. We are too busy judging people's sin because you know what? Their sin, I think, is our sin. And
Right.
we're ashamed of the things inside of us. And so we stuff them down by judging those other people. I'll read a quote
Right.
about that in a minute. But what do you think about that?
No, that's exactly right. It's like, no, we can't talk about this, right? So
Yeah.
let's just put on a show. I've got this. I keep this in my office. It's the Christian playbook. It's like Jesus didn't hand this to her. Like he didn't go, "Hey, listen, before you go back to the village and tell everybody what I just said to you, here's your manual. Here's your 5 week course. On what our doctrine is and what you should believe. Oh, and by the way, the fifth one is going to be on what you should do with your money because we're going to need your money later. So, it's just a bunch of bullshit. It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah,
And
it
and it,
is.
it good people who really need the gospel.
Yeah.
Like really need the gospel to me is I'm going to love you on your worst day.
Yeah.
That's to me, it's that simple. Jesus
Yeah.
said, I'm going to love you on your worst day. While you were a sinner, I'm going to die for you. So we're going to talk about that sin, by the way. We're going to talk about, because it's what you said, Brian. It's we're going to talk about it because there's something deeper than the action, right?
Right.
Before there's a behavior, there's a belief. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that belief. Let's talk about why you hate yourself so much that you were willing to destroy your life with substances or a negative lifestyle. Let's talk about why you hate yourself so bad.
Yeah.
And then let's deal with that. Because once we deal with your self-hatred and the fact that you don't value who you are, and you begin to see that you have value because I gave it to you, because I died on a cross for you, you know what? You're probably going to change that behavior. Your behavior is
Yeah.
going to get, you're going to be transformed. You're not just going to get the Christian playbook and play by the rules. You're going to, the rules will be inside of you. You're
Right.
going to want to change.
Yeah. 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 The rules aren't going to be rules. The rules are they're you're going to be governed by this inner voice of love.
Right.
You don't need, you're not a 2-year-old. You don't need your mother to tell you not to touch a hot stove, right? I mean, you've become an integrated person. So interesting. I want to tell a quick story. Then I want to read a quote from Richard Rohr. But while you were talking, I was recalling a time I was leading worship at a place, and this guy named Jeff Searles was speaking, and he was a worship leader in the Vineyard movement, and he told a story about this guy that played drums on his worship team at his home church that was struggling with smoking weed, and
Most,
he
like most drummers do. I shouldn't
well,
say
yeah,
that.
I mean that just goes with the territory, right? But he told a story about how this guy would come to practice and he'd be high, and Jeff Searles would talk to him, and he said this amazing thing. He said, a lot of people wanted me to kick him off the worship team until he got his stuff together. He said, but if I did that, I couldn't be in relationship with him and walk with him. And that's what we do with Jesus. That's one of the ways we sell a shitty Jesus, is we create this image that says, you know what, if you're struggling with this stuff, you're out of relationship with God, and you got to get it right so you can get back into, I mean, these are literally the words I've heard over and over again, to get into right relationship with God. And it's not about being rightly related because of what you were saying, knowing that you're loved all the time. It's about rightly related because you know what, your behavior lines up with him, and he's not going to kick you out of the room because, you're just a scumbag. That's the
Right.
picture that I've seen personally painted over and over again, and it's so disheartening and it's so destructive.
Yeah.
So do you want to react to that, or can I read this?
No, go ahead and read that quote.
Okay, so this is from Richard Rohr. Like him or not, I think this is a really good quote. I like him. One point here is crucial. The shadow self is not itself evil. That's what we're talking about, right? All these things that are underneath, that are driving these behaviors that maybe we don't even like. Okay, it's not itself evil. It just allows us to do evil without recognizing it as evil. In fact, we often believe that we're doing something good. That's the power of the shadow. Here's the money. That is why Jesus criticizes hypocrisy more than anything else. Jesus is never upset with sinners, but only with people who pretend they are not sinners. Check this out, story by story in the gospel. This is surprising, even shocking. Why is it that this clear pattern is seldom pointed out in sermons? It might have to do with the fact that religion cannot see its own shadow and projects itself elsewhere. Thus, the high degree of morally judgmental people among most religious groups, which allows them to remain untouched in their self-sufficiency, racism, militarism, materialism, etc., etc., etc. I think that's a powerful quote.
I love that quote. Yeah, because it basically says what I've always believed about Jesus is that he does not mad at our sin. He's not upset with the sin. He's upset with, because he called us sick people, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, you're hanging out with sinners. No, he's not. He's hanging out with people who are sick. The sick need a doctor, is what he said in response to that. So he classifies people who are dealing with sin, is what I said earlier, that quote, right? It's the language of the broken. It's the language of the sick. It's the language of the wounded, right? People who've been wounded sin. And so he was like, you're missing the point, guys, by trying to clean these guys up and put them in your trophy case. You're negating the real gospel, which is we got to get to the reason they're sinning. Yeah. We got to get to the shadow. We got to get there because they got broken somewhere, right? That my substance abuse when I was growing up had a lot to do with self-medication. It wasn't that I was some bad pot smoking drinker. It was the fact that numbed me. Numbed me from what? From the fact that I grew up in a shitty home, right? I grew up in a home where I was marginalized and hurt and broken, and I was actually stabbed. So I smoked a little weed, I mean, and Jesus doesn't go, oh, let's get that cleaned up, right? No, it's like, hey, let's get to the reason he's doing that.
Yeah.
And then love him there. Love him right there.
Right.
Love him right
exactly.
there.
Whether he changes or not, it's not about change. It's about love. By the way, little commercial here for Mike. If you've not read this book, get it. You'll understand what Mike's talking about. And that's exactly right. And the thing is that we all have this shadow, right? We all have this thing. And I probably said it before, but it's like the church always taught me that, you repress that, you rebuke that, you whatever, you stuff it, you stuff it, you stuff it, you stuff it. And I mean, if you go talk to a psychology 101 major or, a student in college, they will tell you that, that ain't the way. That ain't the way to go, right? It's why people get addicted to pain medication is because the pain doesn't go away. So they keep taking the medication to deal with the pain, and they never get to the root cause of that pain. And and when we portray this moral policeman Jesus, you got to clean yourself up so that you're in right relationship with him. God, I hate that. I didn't even think about that before this podcast, but that's firing me up today. I'm
triggering you up. Go.
But it keeps people in the prison of their own pain.
Right. That scripture, confess your sin one to another, that what happens when you do that? You become whole. You become healed. Right. It's that I'm going to go down to the lowest form of me and I'm going to deal with this stuff I hate looking at. It's gross. It's shameful to me. But it's almost like it grows bigger when you can't expose it to the light. Right. But when it gets exposed to the light, whether that's confession right to Jesus, or is it confession one to another, it doesn't matter. It's confessing. It's putting it up on the table and dealing with it. It shrinks, right? It doesn't get as big as we think it might be because it's going into its proper place, because it's not the issue. The sin has never been the issue. Jesus didn't make sin with the woman at the well the issue, the woman that was caught in adultery the issue. That was never the issue. Mm-hmm. The issue was your heart. The issue was you're doing these things because you don't like yourself. You have self-hatred because you keep comparing. You keep thinking your value is wrapped up in your righteousness. Well, I'm going to do something about that. I'm going to die on the cross. I'm going to be your righteousness. You're good. You're good. That's That's the
Yeah.
gospel.
Yeah.
That's the good news.
Yeah.
But we keep trying. It's
Yeah.
Jesus plus
Yeah.
that sacrifice plus you gotta tithe. You've got to. We go a whole podcast on that. But you've got to behave a certain way. You got to get your Christian. You got to watch Fox News and you know. Uh, Go Trump, get yourself a Bible, a gun, and a picture of Donald Trump, and you're good. Oh my God. Anyways, it's so crap. It's
it,
shitty Jesus. It's
it,
shitty Jesus. I'm
it,
sorry, but it is.
it is, and I have a friend. I did some. He travels and he speaks. He's kind of a Christian shock jock kind of a guy. But one of the things that he used to say that really impacted me was, think about Pinocchio. Jesus is a real boy, and that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about reality. I mean, Jesus came into the real world, and he encountered real people. He didn't come into your, highfalutin, multi-million dollar church wearing a suit and tie and, hobnobbing with the people who were funding the whole deal. He was a real person. And I was thinking about this morning, and uh, we don't have to get into it now, but think about some of the dudes he picked to hang out with him, right? His 12. What a crowd that was. I mean, we'd look at that and we'd think, man, this dude's, I mean, you'd probably go look for your gun if that crowd came to your door, right? I mean,
A couple of those guys were mafia. I mean,
well,
tax collectors weren't H&R Block. Tax
no,
collectors were the
no.
Gambinos,
Yeah,
right?
they
You
were
know
they
what I
were
mean?
gonna break your arm if you didn't pay up, right? And pay up
Right.
plus, by the way.
Yeah.
Kind of like
Right.
tithing. Anyway, we'll talk about that some other time. But
Christian mafia. Give us
there
your
you go.
tithe
so
in the Bible.
so yeah. So and the reason I get so energized about this conversation is because I think that gets in the way of the tremendous, unstoppable good that what I believe is the unconditional love of God can do for people. And all we do is we erect this barrier between people who need to encounter that healing, that becoming whole. I mean, all being holy is becoming whole. It isn't like you don't glow in
Right.
the dark, right? I mean, it's not like you have a halo over your head. It's like it's about getting healed. It's about becoming whole. And in many
Right.
ways, in my experience, the church has put up a barrier in this false image of Jesus that keeps people
Right.
from encountering that. And that to me is tragic. And let me just say one more thing. I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but
No, you're doing great.
Cheryl was telling me this morning that the word hypocrite, Jesus is the only person who used the word hypocrite in the Bible. And he used it like 20 times in the gospel, depending upon the translation. And who was he talking to, Mike, when he used that word?
Yeah, he wasn't talking to the sinners. He was talking to the church leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
he would do the exact same thing today. I think he would come
Yeah.
in and say, you're a whitewashed wall, you're an empty sepulcher, you're hypocrites, you're posers.
Yeah, you're putting heavy burdens on people.
Right.
I mean, he gave the picture of these, big, whatever, hay or whatever. But really, what it came down to was burdens, like emotional burdens.
Yeah.
There's going to be an emotional price tag for you not, living the way we want you to live. Here's a burden.
Right.
You can't come to our church unless you're cleaned up, unless you get right standing with God.
Yeah.
That's a burden. That's putting heavy burdens on people. I think Jesus would 100% call that out if he was back here today.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And he would go to the heart of people. I think like he did at the woman of the well. He went to the heart of her pain, and he touched the heart of her pain, and he gave her hope at that point, touching the heart of her pain. He gave her hope.
Yeah.
And that to me is why we need to talk a little bit, and let this be episode 1, why we need to talk about shitty Jesus as opposed to at least who you and I have experienced as real Jesus.
Right. So I want to close it up with this story. I'm a school speaker, and I love speaking in high schools, and I had this. Basically, I got motivated because there was a video from Dave Reaver called Davey, and he was doing a school assembly program. I'll never forget this. I was watching him talk to a group of high school kids in the 80s, right? So the mullets were going on and all that mess, and it was a great assembly, and he was talking about different right choices type things, but he closed his assembly with a story. If Dave Reaver was in Vietnam, he had a phosphorus grenade go off in his face. If you look at him, he's pretty nasty to look at. I mean, he said this. I mean, his face is pretty disformed. He has a plastic ear. One of his funny jokes is that he takes his ear off and he'll play the piano, and he goes, "I learned to play the piano by ear." It's hilarious. Like, it's so good. It's so funny. I have a friend of mine who used to travel with him. They would steal his ear, and they would go down to the hotel lobby and go, "Dave, can you hear me, Dave?" And he would tell that story because he was hilarious.
Yeah.
But one of the stories he tells is that when he got blown up in the war and he looked really disfigured, they show pictures of it, and he's laying in the hospital bed, and he was really disfigured. And right next to him was a guy where the fiance came in and saw the guy next to him, and he wasn't nearly as disfigured as Dave. And the fiance took her ring off and put it on his bed and walked away from this guy, right? And so he was so afraid that his fiance was going to come in and do the same thing because he looked way worse. And I'm going to cry because I love this story. But his fiance came in. She was a Christian. Dave was a Christian. He grew up Christian. His wife was a real Christian, and basically took off, came in and saw him laying there. And instead of taking off her ring, she kissed him at the ugliest part of his body and said, "I love you, Davey." And that, like, to me, that's Jesus. Like, he looks at the ugliest part of us. He's not afraid of it. The church is afraid of it because they don't want to deal with their own shit, right?
Yep.
But he's not afraid of it.
Yeah.
And if you're watching this right now, if Jesus Christ was in your room right now, he would love you at your worst possible, nastiest self, because that's where you need him. You need him there. You don't need him in your polished up version of yourself. You need him right there. I need him right there. I'm a sinner, man. I need him.
Yeah. 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 Jesus is a real boy.
Yeah. Amen. Amen.
It's
all right,
awesome
guys, don't
story.
forget to, I love that story. Don't forget to and then, hey, we'll see you on Thursday. We're going to go ahead and do a follow-up with this. I'm sure we're going to get some mail over this. If we don't, I'll be shocked.
I'll be deeply disappointed.
Come on, bring it on, everybody. We'll see you on Thursday night with Groomed in 10.
Bye, everybody.
All right, see you. Bye.